This programme is brought to you by Estates Gazette and BNP Paribas Real Estate.
Welcome to the second edition of the EG London Forum debate, and we're once again joined by our expert panel. Faraz Barber is Executive Director for Policy at London First. Dan Bailey is Head of Central London at our sponsor, BNP Paribas Real Estate. And Simon Ricketts is SJ Berwin, UK Head of Real Estate. Thank you all for joining us again. With the country back in recession and continued worries surrounding the Eurozone, what does this mean for demand for office space? Nathan's been looking at the numbers.
Thanks, Damien. The way you and I use technology, receive our news and communicate with one another has changed dramatically in the past few years. Behind that changing demand has been growth in technology, media and telecommunications companies. The TMT sector is causing quite a stir in London property circles, with take-up in central London surging. LinkedIn, Saatchi & Saatchi and Skype all have office requirements, and BNP PRE's Claire Higgins has been looking at the sector's appetite for space.
One of the things that's come out at an early stage is that 2/3 of respondents said that the style and quality of their office space was crucial to reflecting their brand, and also that the majority of respondents felt that it was crucial to attract the right talent. So I think one of the things that both developers and landlords need to be aware of is that this dynamic and a growing sector has potentially quite different requirements from the sorts of tenants that were traditionally relied upon to underpin that sector.
Moving away from TMT, this time last year BNP PRE predicted banks will need an additional 1.6 million square feet or 4 shards of space in the next 3 years. The agent said banks will add 11,500 employees by 2013. But a lot has changed in the past 12 months. So, is this still the case?
I think this time, it may be that if this uncertainty that we're seeing that in the Eurozone and that's impacting specifically the banks continues to drag on, that those time horizons will be pushed back further. But from having spoken to people in the market in terms of that 3-year horizon or 2 years now, I do think that we will see a recovery and we will see new jobs created again, and that demand will come from that very important sector as a result.
So Dan, the financial services sector isn't growing perhaps as fast as we had expected. Is the TMT sector simply riding to the rescue?
The short answer, Damien, yes, it is at the moment. But I think what we need to remember is that London does have this broad diversity of tenant base. The growth is coming from the TMT sector at the moment, but actually the financial services sector is still a fundamental bedrock of employment in offices in the capital. It's interesting looking back at when we did that survey and talked about the 4 shards worth of demand that was likely to come through. Since then, we've had the Eurozone crisis, which has obviously put a significant brake on financial services employment, not just in the UK, but elsewhere. But strangely, actually, the reaction that other countries are having to how they deal with financial services issues since the crisis, I think will benefit London, because as long as we are seen as a place to do business and we don't over-regulate, I think our benefit will possibly be at the cost of some of certainly the Eurozone countries that are close to us at the moment.
Okay, and Simon, TMT replacing financial services, is that the only place that demand is coming from?
It's very difficult to predict. I mean, broadly, listening to Dan, it was very interesting because I think his analysis reflects, what we see on the transactional side. But it is just such a volatile world at the moment. It's very difficult to predict where the next big letting requirement is coming from. So, we see a huge variety of occupier requirements, and it's very difficult to apply the macro to the micro.
Faraz, you're well plugged into the London business scene, of course. What are your members telling you?
Well, obviously it is turbulent at the moment, and of course speculative development is the bit which is not going as well as one would like to see in terms of the development pipeline for London. Pre-lets are obviously what are kicking through in terms of the next 2 to 3 years. I think the challenge for London is to balance that, because of course, whilst we obviously have new creative markets coming forward like the TMT sector, we do want to make sure that the banking sector and its broader financial services that it supports has the ability to stay in London and has the right space in which to operate in. I think the other point we mustn't forget is we are a world city, and by virtue of that what we are doing is attracting overseas investors to think about locating, overseas occupiers I say, locating in London, and so making sure we have the right space, the right floor plates, the right space for them that they can actually settle down in and develop their industries here is also important. So we mustn't clearly forget about that overseas market that wants to actually bed into a world city like London.
Okay, and Dan, most of what we've been talking about, by implication at least, has been around the West End and the city and perhaps going out towards the Olympic Park. But London is much bigger than that, of course. Are these other areas, north, south and west, being left behind?
It's interesting. Of course, you're right. The central London always gets lots of coverage, and an Olympic year with the Olympics being in East London, that's clearly getting a lot ahead. And actually, the truth is, that's what London really needs, because that's where we have a lung in terms of available space for development. I'm possibly sort of not with the general consensus on this in terms of looking at the outlying locations. I think you have to be pretty special for the outer London boroughs to have a really viable office location. Chiswick Park is a great example of that working. But actually, if you look to the north, you know, Watford, does that count? I'm not really sure, and if it does, it doesn't have the feel and the vibrancy where you'd ever say that is going to be a really important part of the sort of the broader sort of London debate. And going south down to Croydon, likewise, I know that people are talking about bringing forward new development in Croydon. It's going to take a long time for that to transform to be a place where most of London really wants to work, but at the same time, what it should be able to do is provide some of that low-cost back office accommodation which might be suitable for people. I think what sometimes people forget is the financials might work, but are you going to be able to retain your staff in those kind of locations? And are you going to be able to recruit into those locations?
Okay, an important part of that is the retail environment perhaps. So let's now take a look at London's retail sector. BNP PRE recently produced a report on retail risk. Nathan takes a look at where London fits in the picture.
1 in 10 stores in the UK's top retail locations pose a very high risk of closure, while half are considered secure. But BNP PRE's retail risk report finds that London's suburbs are among the safest, with Lewisham, Wood Green and Uxbridge topping the list. The firm's head of retail, Ian Parrish, believes London's position as a global shopping destination will uphold activity levels for the foreseeable future.
You know, London has been and will, I think, remain a bit of a bubble in terms of retailing for the next few years, because all the money is still coming into central London. Shopping is still a massive part of the London economy, and we're still seeing brands coming into London for the first time.
Parrish adds that global and boutique fashion retailers are also looking to locate in parts of London that aren't traditional retail hotspots.
We are seeing some new locations coming out in central London, undoubtedly. Mount Street's one. I think North Audley Street and South Audley Street will improve when the US Embassy is redeveloped longer term. That's going to be another, I think, destination retail location potentially. We're also seeing lots of interest out in the East End. Shoreditch, around there's been a lot of interest recently from some of the unusual retailers. Some people like Hermes trialled a pop-up store out in that area. We've seen the Box Park development out at Shoreditch and Bethnal Green, which is an interesting development. So there's brands trying different locations all the time.
So Faraz, if brands try something new all the time, is it a given that London will stay quite so resilient? Might they look elsewhere, whether it's Birmingham or Milan for that matter?
Well, I mean, London has to remain competitive. It has to be seen to be the one that can bring forward the footfall, and if it can, brands will stay in London. And of course, we've seen a variety of different retail offers across London, both in terms of, you know, the big shopping malls through to actually, you know, core high streets. The key for us to remember on any retail offer is that, particularly in our outer London boroughs, is that we must make sure that we don't see them as isolated villages, and that we see the high street as an integrated element within the sort of London framework, and that is important to see them in that context rather than sort of urban villages, if you will, to make sure that people can feel that they can access these quite readily and easily, and that in itself, I think, will ensure that the brands will continue to flourish in a place like London.
But high streets are pretty vulnerable, aren't they? In many parts of London as much as they are in large swathes of the country.
Well, they have been vulnerable, and in some cases there are a number of reasons why that might be the case. This, obviously, we've seen in the last mayoral administration that there's been a real injection of money to try and actually conquer some of those challenges. The Outer London Fund, which gave £50 million investment towards these areas, is an example of that. And of course, one of the things we just want to make sure is that we get the sort of social cohesion element that we've seen, unfortunately, in the past, where some of these town centres have had some difficulties. So we want to make sure that the brand and image and the security is all wrapped into that. And I think the Outer London Fund that the Mayor originally set out to achieve will help regenerate these places and make them a destination point for people to visit.
And Simon, does the planning regime itself increase the risk of the high street failing?
I don't think it does. I think, you know, to start with, I'd say that in London you have a series of fantastic shopping offers, whether it's in the West End. We haven't spoken about the real renaissance of Regent Street as the place for experience retail, where international brands are looking to, you know, establish flagship stores. Then we've got the way in which the planning system has arrived at these fantastic 2 Westfield developments, and then gradually we've got the southern and northern London schemes, Croydon and Brent Cross Cricklewood, coming through the system. And yes, that does leave the high streets. Well, maybe neighbourhood planning, if it has a function in London, is really to start looking at the fine grain of districts, district centres and high streets, and see what really needs to be done. And that needs to be done by the people who live, experience them on a day-to-day basis and shop in them.
Okay, and Dan, we talked in the last episode about London being on a different path to the rest of the country. Is London retail on a different path still, or is it closely tied to commercial and perhaps residential success?
I think it is on a different path, because I think the purpose of London, and when I say I particularly think about central London retail, is very different to the rest of the country. A vast majority of the people that one sees in Oxford Street, Regent Street, and to a degree even the big Westfields and the like, are people who are tourists to London, whether they're coming from outside of the country or within the country. And for them, it is a leisure pursuit, is part of the reason why they've come here. And that's the challenge for other cities and areas outside of London, because that is not part and parcel of what those cities are about generally. And I think what's interesting, you get into a virtuous circle as well, which is to the great benefit of London. As someone who is fundamentally more of an offices man, when I'm talking to a client and marketing companies for an office scheme that I'm involved with and trying to sell it, the first thing I think about in the marketing collateral is not how big the floor plate is and what the daylight is like from the windows. Yes, that's important, but actually it's selling the amenity offer around those buildings. And if you've got a fine looking office building, but it is in a desert in terms of amenity, and retail being the fundamental amenity, it makes that job very, very hard. But actually London has increasingly got that benefit. You know, take the city, for example, with One New Change. It's been a great success at bringing new people into the city from a tourist and shopping and GDP perspective, but also it makes the city a far more viable location for some of those occupiers that historically might have thought it was a bit staid and dull. So there's a great symbiotic relationship between retail and offices in central London.
Okay, so perhaps the recession may not matter. I'm afraid that's it for this EG London Forum. Many thanks to our panellists, Faraz Barbar, Dan Bailey and Simon Ricketts. Our London Forum panel will continue to offer their views on the state of the capital in EG London each month. And we'll be back for another London Forum debate soon. Goodbye and thank you for watching.
This programme was brought to you by Estates Gazette and BNP Paribas Real Estate.